Today we're going to talk about reasonable expectations. What do Florida fans feel like is a reasonable expectation for the rest of the season? I think heading into the season, most people wanted to see an improvement on the win-loss record. Florida has 6 wins last year, 6 wins the year before, back-to-back losing seasons, and they're looking for steps. So, what's the easiest way to grade the team? Wins and losses. Looking at the schedule, 3-1 was a start that I think a lot of people were hoping for. I thought that, looking at Utah on the road, they haven't lost there in 2 years. There's a reason why they haven't lost there in 2 years. It's a tough place to play. So most reasonable fans were okay with that loss. The way the loss happened, obviously, most fans were not okay with that loss. Now it makes the Tennessee game even more important. What happens? Florida comes back. They play at home, a place where they've owned Tennessee. I think 9 games in a row at home, they beat Tennessee, make it 10, whatever. Now the expectations go up a notch. So if you're like me, when you think about the Florida Kentucky game, what do you think of? I think of Danny Werfel, throwing a ball with 20 seconds left to win a game, and 26 games in a row, Florida beats Kentucky. I think about Jacquez Green. I think 2 punt returns for a touchdown one time against Kentucky in the Swamp. I think about 77 points. There's all kind of things that I think of when I think about the Florida and Kentucky matchup. And it still hasn't quite hit most Florida fans, I don't think anyways, that Kentucky has kind of had Florida's number the last couple of years, winning, the last 2 games. Heading into this game, I call this a must-win for Florida. I didn't think Utah was a must-win. I didn't believe Tennessee was a must-win. I thought that Tennessee was probably going to be a little bit better at the quarterback position than what they showed. I'll be interested to see kind of how they perform the rest of the year and that whole quarterback situation with, Heupel and that whole offense. This game, going into Lexington, a noon game, second road game of the season, first day game for the Gators. I'm not particularly fired up about the noon start because I feel like sometimes Florida gets off to a slow start when they play on the road and at noon. That might just be in my head. However, I think this matchup actually favors Florida in a bunch of different ways. I think that defensively, what Kentucky wants to try to do is, and what they've shown in the past, they want to defend against the big play. They want to defend against the threat of the vertical passing game, which I believe is going to play right into the hands of Coach Napier and the Florida offense. Obviously, if you're a Florida fan, and you are because you're watching this, you have watched the Florida offense these last 4 weeks, and you have not seen a lot of vertical shots down the field. There's been a few here and there, but not many. So if Kentucky's mindset is to keep everything in front and defend or guard against, the vertical pass over the top of the defense, to me, that's going to play right into the hands of the Gators offense. It's more of a West Coast style kind of dink and dunk, get the ball out quickly, east and west, get the ball to your playmakers in space, let them make a guy miss, and off to the races. So I think that actually will play right into the strength of Florida's offense. So I think Kentucky will be doing Florida a favor if that's how they want to come out and try to defend them. So I look for Florida to kind of establish their offense, some high percentage throws early in the game, just like they did when they played Tennessee. Those 2 14-play drives basically just killed Tennessee's defensive front, and you knew it was setting up for later in the game Florida's offense to have big-time success running the ball, which I believe is the staple of a Billy Napier coached offense. They want to run the ball and they want to show physicality. And that's what they did against Tennessee. And I think that's what they're going to be able to do against Kentucky on Saturday. I think the weakness of Kentucky's offense is, excuse me, they do have a gunslinger at quarterback, but the real weakness for them is going to be center, left guard, right guard. They're shuffling some guys around. They haven't really played great in the middle. And I think that's going to pay huge dividends for the Florida defensive front, in particular, Caleb Banks, Cameron Jackson. I think those guys will be able to have the biggest impact of the year on Saturday, and they'll be able to occupy blocks, free up Scooby, free up Shamar James. Those guys will be able to get after the quarterback. I believe that Florida can get pressure with the front four, And this is going to be very important for Saturday because Kentucky, this isn't the traditional Kentucky team of years past where they want to, run off guard up the middle, all this kind of stuff. They actually are going to take a lot of vertical shots down the field. And if Florida can get pressure with those front four guys, then I think it's going to be a long day for Kentucky. And I'm thinking, 31-20 type of game for Florida. They restore order in this rivalry, if you can call it a rivalry, which, saying this is a rivalry game from the Florida side of things still is something I think that most people don't really cope with. It just doesn't make a lot of sense when you say this. So this is a huge game for Billy Napier. They're 3-1. If you can walk out of Lexington with a W, 2-0 in the SEC, 4-1 overall, you get to act a little revenge on Vanderbilt the following weekend. And then you have another monumental, huge road game the following week in Columbia against South Carolina. I think that game is actually a little more dangerous than Kentucky just because Rattler has the ability to get really hot. I watched him when they played Georgia, and, when he had time, he picked Georgia's defense apart. So, once they started applying pressure to him, then they kind of struggled. But, what quarterback's not going to struggle with a 325-pound D tackle breathing down his neck? So I get all that stuff, but this is a huge game. I mean, Florida wins this game. The fan base is back. They're energized. They're pretty much back now. You lose this game, you fall to 3-2. I think most people had Florida probably sitting at 3-2 after the first 5 games of the season. So this will be a huge win to go to 4-1. You lose the game. Obviously, I don't think anybody's going to be worried about Vanderbilt, but nobody worried about Vanderbilt last year. So you lose this game now, people are going to start to question. On the road, you lose to Utah. On the road, you lose to Kentucky. Beat Vanderbilt, great. You're supposed to beat Vanderbilt, but now you got a trip to Columbia. So if you can't beat Kentucky on the road, I'm not sure how many people are going to be fired up about going to Columbia. But, it's amazing how one win changes the whole feel of the trajectory of the program. And that's exactly what happened when they beat Tennessee. So, I was expecting – I thought it was a brilliant half of football. We never really got a chance to talk about this. I thought it was a brilliant half of football. I expected to see the first half Florida offense against Tennessee in the Swamp to be the same offense in the second half, if that makes sense. I didn't think there was a lot of high risk reward type plays being called, but they didn't need to have high risk reward type plays called because the plays they were doing, which maybe, people call safe, they were working and they were going up and down the field on Tennessee. So there was really no reason to change that offense going into the second half. However, most fans, as you already know, were a little bit disgruntled about only 4 pass attempts in the second half after going 18 for 20 in the first half. I think it was something like that, something crazy, so I think they expected to see kind of the foot on the pedal, so to speak. And they kind of got pretty conservative. They had a 3-score lead. And that game was so huge just for the confidence for Coach Napier and his staff and the players. I totally get it. And I totally understand why he maybe went a little bit conservative. He mentioned that in his press conference that he thought he went a little bit too conservative. And he's never been a head coach in the SEC. So let's give him a little bit of credit for doing what had to be done to get the win, which brings me to my next point. Sometimes it's not good enough just to win for the fan base and to appease the fans. It's how you win. So, at least according to the fans, it is. The bottom line is 2-3 weeks from now, based off what happens these next 2 or 3 weeks, nobody's going to care what happened in the second half of the Tennessee game. All they're going to look back on and see is that Florida got the win. So, I think a couple players that could have a really big day on Saturday, obviously, getting Kingsley back will really shore up the middle of the offensive line. And he's kind of the guy that makes the reads, the calls, the protections, all that kind of stuff. And when he's not there, there's a noticeable difference between, his level of play and where, Jake Slaughter's been so far. So, from what I understand, he didn't re-injure himself in the Tennessee game, but he was in a lot of pain just from the previous injury that he had sustained earlier in practice. And with it being Charlotte, there was really no reason to risk him being out there and injuring that leg or the lower body injury, any further than already. So they wanted to give him 2 weeks. I'm sure it helped. I'm sure he'll be out there. Eugene Wilson, we're going to wait. I'm not even going to try to speculate whether or not he plays or not. I think he will play. So, he's a guy that definitely makes the Florida offense go. And it's funny because, people were saying, gosh, Jason, but, Eugene Wilson's not in the game and the offense looks totally different. And I agree, the offense does look totally different, but he only played the first drive in the Tennessee game. Now, granted, he had 6 touches. I mean, he was on pace to touch the ball, 35 times in the Tennessee game? So I would have been curious to see, had he not get injured, how many times he actually did touch the ball. But hopefully we'll get a chance to see him on Saturday and get Eugene back. And I still like Andy Jean. I still would like to see Mizell maybe just on some go routes just to kind of, soften up the defense. But again, if they're going to guard against the big play and they're worried about Florida receivers getting deep on them, I think it's actually going to play right into the hands of Billy Napier, the Florida offensive line, Graham Mertz, who's done a phenomenal job knowing where to go with the ball. They're calling high percentage pass plays for a reason. He's completing those plays. The defense is playing, fantastic with what they've done so far. I think top 10 in, total defense, pretty much every category that you can think of. So, they didn't play great on the road against Utah. They weren't great on the road last year. So now that they've won a big game at home against Tennessee, I think the next step in the progression for Coach Napier and the rest of this team is to go on the road in this conference and get a win. And so be it that it's Kentucky. I like the matchups. I know that the Kentucky front four defensively is kind of the strength of their team, but I do like the matchup with the Florida offensive line, especially, with Kingsley back. And I expect to see more of the same from the Florida offense, and I expect the Florida defense to really take it to Kentucky's offensive line. And I think that's where the difference in the game will be. I think Florida's much better defensive line versus defensive line and offensive line versus offensive line. Florida gets the nod, I think, in both those categories. They walk out of Lexington 4-1 on the year.